Good evening and welcome. Congratulations on being able to get here this evening. Thank you for being with us. I'm Tony Marks, the president of the library. And tonight we are proud to present a timely and vital conversation about our power as citizens and the power of state governments to deliver lasting change to the people they represent. That is the subject of a new book, The Fourth Branch, about state legislators working to shape everyday life and the impact that they have had and can have on everything from climate change to minimum wage to reproductive rights and many more. The author is Daniel Squadron. And he'll be speaking with, Mayor Zohran Mamdani. Their bios are in the program, so I'm going to skip that part. It's, of course, fitting that this conversation happen at a public library, at the public library. This mayor, of course, understands the power of libraries as foundational to democracy and the role they play in communities in this city and in our country. We're grateful for the mayor's support of the New York Public Library, of the libraries of New York, and look forward to working with him as he continues to invest. It's also fitting that we should have this conversation on the eve of an historic moment, the 250th anniversary of the most famous piece of writing by Thomas Jefferson, the Declaration of Independence, and the birth of our country. The library joins our nation in commemorating 250 years because we are committed to the democratic access to truthful knowledge. We are the repositories of such, and to mark this moment, we will have special exhibitions, free programs, events, educational offerings. On June 15th, we'll open a huge set of exhibitions in this country, Declaring America is the title, that will unpack the complex, diverse, and powerful stories of the American Revolution from 1776 to today. We will celebrate and inform, including an exhibition on how protests have brought achievement of rights to the United States. No sugarcoating here. This is American history in all of its complications. We'll have a storytelling project with StoryCorps so that New Yorkers and anyone can contribute their thoughts about the 250th anniversary and what lies ahead. We'll have a special edition library card. Just gave one to the mayor. And on July 1st to 7th, we'll offer a rare opportunity. Thomas Jefferson's fair copy, one of two copies in the world of the Declaration in his hand, will be on public display in this room. It is a remarkable document for so many reasons, including that it shows his intention, because it's his draft, to include a paragraph decrying the slave trade, a paragraph that never made it into the Declaration of Independence. Very interesting questions. This from a slaveholder. Turns out the founders were complicated. Turns out U.S. history is complicated. What isn't complicated is that this is the people's institution. Everyone is welcome. You can meet people, ideas, backgrounds different from your own. So much will be going on. Check it out at nypl.org/US250th. Back to this evening. Pre-signed copies of Dan's book are available for sale, or you can check it out from the New York Public Library. Unusually, we're going to end this without question and answer at 7:45 because someone needs to get somewhere. And that's with, presumably, the best traffic control available to anyone trying to get anywhere this evening. Go Knicks. Live from NYPL is made possible by the continuing generosity of Celeste Bartos, Manaz Espahani Bartos, and Adam Bartos, and of course, by all of you and all who love and support the library. Now please join me in welcoming Daniel Squadron and Mayor Zohran Mamdani.
Good evening, everyone. It's a great place to be here to say Nixon 4. And it's a true privilege to be here alongside my friend and author, Daniel Squadron.
Thank you. Thank you so much for being here. You know, I've been a Knicks fan too long. I will never say how many games. I'll just say, let's go Knicks. I want the banner, whatever.
Every friend group needs one.
Yes. I am that guy.
But it is such a pleasure to be here to discuss this incredibly important book and to have a chance to discuss a part of government that is oftentimes overlooked. And I wanted to begin with just some of your reflections of what it was like when you first entered into state government here in New York.
You know, like you, I was originally elected in a Democratic primary. I took on a 30-year incumbent. I was in my late 20s. And the number one question I would get when I told people, you know, I want to run for the state senate, would be why? And I talk about this in the book. There were 3 categories of why. One was people who were really close to me and not that focused on politics. And they were like, why would anyone ever do that? The second group was folks who were generally in politics. And they were like, why wouldn't you go to anywhere else? The city council, you know, work for someone in Congress. And then the third group were folks who really worked in Albany. They would say, why? I can't believe I'm still here. And I ran the race and was successful and entered the first Democratic majority since the Great Depression, effectively. And it was as bad as everyone had said. The place was run by lobbyists. You know, you would have colleagues, I talk about in the book, colleagues coming up to me and saying, you know, I've got a problem with your bill. And I'd say, oh, talk to me about it. They say, oh, no, I don't know what it is, but the horse guys have a problem. There are horse guys in Albany, by the way. You probably know that, actually, right? But the other thing I found, like immediately, and this was the toughest majority, it was 1-seat majority. I think 6 of my Democratic colleagues subsequently lived in federal prisons. But they weren't visiting. But the thing I found is, as an idealistic, aggressive person in my late 20s, if I had 20 things I wanted to do, get federal funding for public housing, pass a new kind of corporation in the entire state, get Brooklyn Bridge Park built, 12 of those 20 I was able to get done in the first 2 years. And I thought, the one thing no one tells you about this place is there's so much power.
Truly, I think it's almost an inverse relationship between the way Albany shapes someone's life in New York City and how much someone in New York City knows about Albany. I mean, the thing that I tease every state senator about, or former state senator, is the fact that at least people know what a senator is. When I told people I was running for assembly, no one had any idea what that even meant. And so I had to explain that this was like, you know, the House version that we had here at the state level. But I think to your point, you will find such immense potential in what Albany can do and what possibility it can give birth to. And I was just joking earlier with Daniel that, you know, you can leave Albany, but Albany never leaves you. And even now as the mayor of New York City, so much of what it is that we hope for in our city is something that we can only fulfill through that same kind of partnership. How did you feel did Albany change when you first came to it versus when you left?
Well, we lost that majority, so that was bad. You know, an insight in the book that's pretty important is it's better to be in the majority.
This is what you will find if you buy this book. Incredible conclusions, lots of years of research.
Some people say to me, who wants a civic lesson? And I feel like if you need a civic lesson for that, you know, don't buy the book, actually. So the minority, you really are sort of an observer with an all-access pass. You can go everywhere, but you can't decide anything. And so being in the minority was very different. And then the other thing that happened is a group of Democrats went over to give Republicans the majority, the famous Independent Democratic Conference, which was, you know, as the old joke goes, neither independent nor democratic nor a conference. And so as a result, you had this kind of strange world where Democrats should have been in power and weren't. And out there in the world, it was the second Obama term, and, you know, partisan warfare was alive and well. And in Albany, no one cared. No one cared. We had a Democratic governor. I mean, either didn't care or was feeling pretty good about it.
Or cared very deeply.
Yeah, correct, exactly. The IDC was announced the day of his first state of the state. You know, he's a guy who just lets things happen, right?
Yes, famously.
Is this like inside jokes? Or, I don't know. Talking about Andrew Cuomo, who was the governor of New York for a few years. Who you've met?
No, I've met a few times, but only in public.
You know, it's funny. That was a line we would use in Albany a lot when people would get indicted. Oh, yeah, we spoke, but only in public.
So what did it take to turn your experience in Albany into the States Project?
So it was really that experience. So, you know, these two things were happening. One, there was this political battle in the state that no one could be bothered with. Like, you know, it really felt like the politics of Albany were an afterthought. And all of these important issues were not getting done for that reason. And the other was I became aware in 2012 of a group called ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council. It's the most important civic organization most people have never heard of. I became aware of them because a Florida teen named Trayvon Martin was murdered in his neighborhood. And something called a stand your ground law in Florida meant that his killer would not be prosecuted. And it turned out that bill wasn't written by some enterprising Florida right-winger. It was written by ALEC and distributed to states around the country and done to help the bottom line of gun companies who didn't want to be sued for wrongful death. And then it turned out there were another couple of dozen bills in the New York legislature, in New York of all places, written by ALEC. Sometimes they still had the watermark. And my Republican colleagues, when they had those bills, made us look so bad, because those bills were so clever. And they were written by special interests in a national network. So those two facts, after Donald Trump was elected, made me feel that we had to do something. The real issue was no one cares about state legislatures. And so in December of 2016, I was invited to a holiday party on a Saturday night to speak to them as the state senator. Now, you were in the assembly a few years. How many times were you invited to a social party to speak as the assembly member? Like, oh, you know who we really want tonight? We want Assemblymember Mamdani. Did that happen any times?
No.
This was the only, you know, it's weird times after Trump's first election.
Yes.
I didn't really want to go. It was my son Humphrey is here, and my son Theo. It was my son Humphrey's 3rd birthday, so there was no way I was leaving the house before he went to bed. But, you know, I kind of traipsed over. It was a book party for young adult authors. These are adults writing books for young adults. And it was sort of this beautiful...
Thank you for the clarifications. Yeah.
Someone asked me, you'll see where the story goes. At the end of it, one person said to me, like, you said that to children? Here, just think about imagining I'm speaking to children as the story continues. And so I was a little irritated, right? It was this beautiful party, and the person who introduced me said, look at everyone in this room. If a comet hit this house tonight, what would the children read? So I was... It turns out it's true there's some actually incredibly talented authors in that room. So I just got up there and said, you know, like, stop sending tweets, stop calling Chuck Schumer's office, stop sending a tweet a day. Like, Donald Trump didn't come from nowhere, and you're not going to beat him on social media. You want to do something for this country, you can change state legislatures. It's cheaper to win an entire chamber in a campaign than a single congressional district. The people in this room could change the direction of a state in a year if they tried with $100,000. But you're not.
Going once?
Someone from the Stage Project is back there, and someone over here is thinking, like, he said that to 12-year-olds? And I said, you're not going to do it. You're not going to do it, but if you actually cared, you would. People who cared about power do. And I got off stage, I was ready to leave, and a redheaded woman and a short black-haired woman stopped me. And the redheaded woman said, we can do it. We'll raise $100,000. And I said, yeah, here's my card, call me if you do. They gathered a group of authors and raised $100,000 by Trump's inauguration.
Wow.
And I couldn't believe it. And they should be cheered for because they're here. Gail Foreman, who's still on the board, and Melissa Walker, who runs our Giving Circle program.
I must ask you to stand up.
Yes.
Please. Thank you.
And anyone I could talk to, I said, I don't believe this is possible. I mean, this is really a thing. And a guy named Adam Pritzker, who was a New Yorker at the time, heard about it. He wanted to do something in politics. And he said, this is an exciting idea, getting grassroots people engaged, but you got to leave office because it's got to be a full-time thing. And if you do, we'll do it together. He's still the chair of the States Project. We've been partners now for almost 9 years. We have more than 250 giving circles. They raise more than $20 million a cycle in contributions of $200 or less overwhelmingly. And they are the most important force to let state legislative candidates get off the phones to special interests and get on the doors to potential constituents.
Wow. That's incredible. And as one of the core arguments of your book is the incredible ways in which states can shape working people's lives. And frankly, in a stark contrast to what Congress can do or has done. When you're looking at the examples both of your own life as well as of states across the country, what does your framework say about how cities and states can actually work together?
Well, Mr. Mayor, you may not have read this page, but cities are creations of the state. The federal government, by the way, did not create states. States also created the federal government. They are the basic building block of our country, the United States, of course. And
we do a lot of cliffhangers in this talk.
So much information in this book. Wow.
To complete the sentence, of America. We'll leave it there.
I stopped hoping that it wouldn't sound so ridiculous.
I just want to get there.
So it's important to remember that localities need to work within the framework set for them by states. But it's also true that the right wing, which has been thinking about state power for hundreds of years for sure, but certainly for the last 50 in kind of the modern moment, have thought about how they can wield their power over cities and localities for their ideological purpose. And it tends to be that those on the left think of what's the appropriate relationship between cities and states. And so you end up, even in a state like New York, with a asynchronous or an unevenness between what you would want to do to support cities, where, of course, lots of people who most depend on government live, the nature of being a city dweller, and a sort of a right-wing ideology that would never win in any city where people are living that way, but sort of is able to be a shadow over it.
And you're saying that this kind of right-wing project begins about, 50, 60 years ago. Is there a precipitous event that takes place? Is there a moment? And what kind of drives that?
Yeah, so in 1972, a guy named Paul Weyrich founds the Heritage Foundation. Very famous, the author of Project 2025. The same year, the same guy founds ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, which I talked about before. What's so interesting about it is he wasn't a Republican operative trying to build Republican power. He was a Republican operative trying to fundamentally change the party. In 1964 and 65, he had three kind of amazing experiences. He worked on the Barry Goldwater campaign, which didn't do very well, and was disappointed about that. He hated the Voting Rights Act that the Supreme Court just gutted, and the Great Society bills that were signed in 1964 and 65 by Lyndon Johnson. But the most important thing in that 2-year period was Vatican II, the modernization of the Catholic Church. He felt his religion had been ripped from him. He started referring to the Washington diocese as the loose leaf diocese. He said every week I showed up, there was something new in there. He actually left the Roman Catholic Church for the Eastern Church. He wanted to found Heritage and build ALEC and build the first right-wing media network with Roger Ailes in the 70s. It didn't work out. And the Moral Majority, all of which he founded or co-founded, to try to bring God's kingdom back to earth through the US government. It was a very specific idea. And the reason he went to states is the same argument, unbeknownst to me, that I made to those young adult authors. It's the place you could have the biggest impact. The Kochs were the same thing. People think of the Koch network as the sort of Republican network. In 1976, the Kochs founded a think tank, the Cato Institute, to take on the Republican establishment. They were libertarians who cared a little bit about their bottom line. In 1980, one of them was on the vice presidential ticket against Ronald Reagan, against George Bush. They became Republicans in the 80s and 90s and did the same thing. They went to states, it helped their bottom line. Koch Industries companies are regulated by states, and it also helped their worldview. And that's what happened there. And the idea of a worldview, left of center, just hasn't been how we've been organized in the same way. Though you may have some thoughts on that.
I think it is incredibly refreshing to have a perspective on power that is in tune not with perception but reality. And I think that your assessment of the role that states play in working people's lives, whether in New York or elsewhere, is also an assessment not just of kind of where we have been and the asymmetry in the focus and investment and commitment, but also where the potential lies for the future in unlocking that. And I think the point about kind of you could flip an entire chamber, as you said, for the cost of one congressional race is also one that forces us to reckon with what is it that we are interested in. And if it is power to be able to unlock working people's potential, then this book reminds us where a lot of that power lies. And you mentioned this in passing of the gutting of the Voting Rights Act and thinking about redistricting. What is your assessment of how those in this room, those across this country should approach this moment where we have seen the partisan gerrymandering that is taking place across the country and the rush to be able to respond to that in kind?
Well, I think the first thing has just been made extremely clear in the last year, which is if you care about winning Congress and you're ignoring state legislatures, you're missing the entire point. State legislatures draw congressional districts. And one person understands that very well, and they're on 34th Street, 33rd Street right now. And he actually picked up the phone last year to Texas state lawmakers and said, I want you to redistrict. You know how many times a Democratic president has picked up the phone? How many times did President Biden call you when you were in the assembly? No, just I'll give you a second.
The number is coming to me soon.
And that's true for rank and file members, but it's even true for the speaker, even in a state like New York. And he got on the phone and said, I know we don't normally redraw congressional districts in the middle of a decade, but I'm in political trouble. We can do it. He worked with Greg Abbott to use the terrible tragedy on the Guadalupe River to call the Texas legislature back into session and just redrew those maps, which, by the way, is ugly, but it's totally constitutional. Especially
Can you say more to that?
Sure. The idea that state legislatures have control over their own congressional maps is baked into the Constitution. The Voting Rights Act was meant to put a limit on their ability to draw districts that had entire communities unable to have their voice heard. But the idea that legislatures draw the map is baseline. He then called Indiana state lawmakers. In fact, he took the names of those who wouldn't agree with him and then funded a super PAC to beat them in a Republican primary. I believe that in light of that, you need to understand everything you possibly can do to win power within the constitutional system. I think he and that movement don't believe in the last part of that sentence. But I don't think it's about how we feel. And redistricting is the perfect example. That's why I was so proud that we were able to work with Virginia lawmakers who did their very, very best to pass to give Virginians the chance to pass new congressional maps. And I'll just end this answer by saying this, because I actually think people want to hear a little bit from you. But I'll say this, which is the reason Virginia wasn't able to let Virginians, 3.1 million of them who voted, decide to change a congressional map that probably would have changed 4 congressional seats was because the Virginia Supreme Court, the state Supreme Court, voted 4-3 to nullify those Virginians' voices. Unprecedented. Maybe the most chilling anti-democratic act, certainly of a while, and maybe going back to 2020. The reason there was a 4-3 majority that was willing to nullify votes was because in 2021, the Virginia legislature was 1 vote short of appointing different judges. 1 seat in the Virginia legislature in 2021 is going to lead to 4 congressional seats in 2026. And yet no one was looking at Virginia, and now everyone's tearing their hair out about Congress. When you got to the Assembly, what was sort of both your impressions, your first question to me, but also, did you sort of see this potential for impact?
You know, I got to the Assembly after a 423 or 424 vote win in my primary.
Landslide.
Yeah. 2020. You know, I'll just tell you, in 2020, we had about half of the electorate voted by mail. And so on election day, you get the result of half. So I was up about 600 votes. And then we had to wait a month to find out about the other votes. So it was a month of purgatory. And then I went for the vote count, all of our volunteers. And I was like, you know, I'll just be here for the first election district that we win. I'll just be here to support, and then I'll head home. The team's all been trained. Everybody's ready for it. We go. They take out this election district. First vote, my opponent. Second vote, my opponent. Third vote, my opponent. 13 straight votes for my opponent. Election district is called. I'm like, I got to take a second. I go to the bathroom. I just throw this water on my face. I'm like, this is not going well. I actually end up going home, and I remember calling my parents and telling them I think it's done. Because in about 2 hours, we went from a 600 vote lead to a 400 vote lead. I decided that was the right time to watch The Notebook, which I'd never seen before. There's a tub of Haagen-Dazs, The Notebook, a dwindling vote count. Thankfully, it stopped at a 400 point. And I ended up winning that race. And then in January, I went into the state legislature, and it was particular because of being at the peak of COVID. And so much of the engagement was through Zoom. You know, a lot of members, myself included, we were using Zoom as a way to communicate. And I remember one of the first times I went up to Albany, a colleague came up to me and he said, "You're much taller than I thought." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "I thought you were so angry for, you know, I thought you would be much shorter." Just,
There's a lot there.
this is the first time I'd ever spoken to this guy. I said, no, it's the state of the state that has me feeling this way. But Albany was a different world, both in the understanding of how things worked and also the immense breadth of power as to so much of what New Yorkers define as local government in their day-to-day lives is actually state government. Intuitively, you would think it is city government. But when you think about train delay, when you think about your rent going up, if you're in a market rate apartment, when you think about so many of the different ways in which you measure your day-to-day experience, it is Albany that is deciding. And so in that, it was incredibly exciting because we could have these debates around the MTA. We could have these debates around good cause eviction, putting a limit on how much a capricious rent increase could go by year after year. And that was something that to me was incredibly exciting. And even in that first year, when I came in, it was a year where the governor was Andrew Cuomo. And he was described to so many of us that were entering into state government as immovable. And yet this was a year where his political fortunes changed entirely. And his relationship to the state legislature changed. And a lot of it was because more than a dozen women had the courage to speak up. And that was a year where we were facing the potential of an immense deficit. And one of the proudest memories that I have is the organizing that happened in that year that I was privileged to be one small part of, where we won the very kinds of things that when we came into Albany, we were told this is simply impossible to win on a one-year scale. And that's a memory that I really hold on to, is when you are told by someone with full sincerity that this is simply out of the bounds of possibility. If you build a strong enough coalition, you can completely redefine that understanding of possibility.
And that story plays out across the country. I talk about, on the other side of things, the bill that ended up undoing Roe v. Wade, that started in Mississippi, and talk to David Barria, who's from a small town in coastal Mississippi, who's the Democratic minority leader of the House. He doesn't even remember the bill specifically because they were just throwing bill after bill. But what he says is that had started over a one-year shift, whereas he puts it, the Republicans in Mississippi got fully MAGAfied. And prior they weren't, and it's that kind of quick shift. Or Tony Vargas, who is a Democrat from Nebraska, which of course, as you know, is the only unicameral state. Sorry to cut you off there, but everyone else did too.
I want to respect your time.
But as a Democrat, Democrats are in the superminority. Nebraska is officially also nonpartisan. He was the third in leadership in the entire chamber, and then that shifted. These shifts in legislatures, for good or for ill, you talk about a success, are so dramatic, and it really can change. I mean, we have a lot of people in this room. You could have 3 issues that Albany has to contend with 12 months from now, their last week of session, if you had 3 groups out of this room decide it. One other thing happened, though. You remembered exactly how many votes you won your first assembly race for. You've won some other races that were higher profile, but you probably will never remember the exact vote count like your race for the state legislature. Now that you bring it up, right?
No, I think waiting for the month was an incredibly difficult way.
Also not uncommon. There are 2 stories in the book of tied races. Yeah. In fact, the speaker in Alaska today, who's an independent, runs a coalition of Democrats, Independents, and Republicans working together. His first race, 725 to 725. Flipped a coin.
Wow.
He won.
God. Maybe I shouldn't, 423 is fine.
As you look at the platform that you now have, I'm really struck. Today is a big day in New York City. Turns out that you can really fill a library, which we appreciate. This time last year, you were in the state assembly. And when you just look at that change, because this is one of the wild things about being in the legislature. I experienced this. People I talk to in the book talk about it. You both have all this power, and you have to juggle all of the normal everyday things because you're like a normal person who it's like costing you money to serve. What does that shift got to be like?
I mean, it is hard to put into words. When I started the race, October 23 of 2024, it's not just that I was a state legislator. It's that I was, for many, a little-known state legislator. Even amongst state legislators.
A little redundant.
Right? Trust me, it didn't feel that way. Life has fully changed. I think one interesting through line is the importance of Albany through it all. And over the course of much of the race, I would be going up to Albany and back down and up and back down. And obviously I spend less time there, but the focus is still the same. And at a personal level, it is a very different life to live on 35th Street and Broadway in Astoria to now living in Gracie Mansion. But one of the many beautiful things about it is I can step out on the porch and I can still see Astoria. And it is a beautiful sense of being at home. And I think one of the great gifts is that every single night I get to be in New York City. And when you're serving in Albany, you're serving in Albany for New York City. But it often feels so far away. It feels as if a different world. And now to get to do both, it's an incredible gift.
And I bet you do this. I do this whenever I'm in Lower Manhattan, in one of the tall buildings. I had Lower Manhattan in Brooklyn. I always say, that's the old district. I bet you stand on the porch of Gracie Mansion, you have a visitor, and I bet you point across and you say, that's the old district. Every old state lawmaker does that.
Try to keep that to myself.
Oh, really?
One thing I will, a question that I had for you as we're speaking about kind of the way that politics has been contested, what is constitutional, how to understand power. We were talking about redistricting. One thing that was also different for me is when I first ran for the state assembly, there were no matching funds. Every dollar you raised, that's the dollar that you got. And when I ran for mayor, one of the most transformative things was that I could raise millions of dollars and be calling people for $50 at a time or $100 at a time because we had these matching funds. How do you think about matching funds as a tool in terms of the kind of politics that you're looking to build?
Yeah, and I had the same experience. I ran in Albany. I less successfully ran citywide in 2013, but it was the same experience. Any conversation could be a meaningful fundraising conversation. It changed who you spent your time talking to. It is one of those sort of structural shifts that could really reinvigorate civic life in this country, and states could do it. We don't need to wait for the federal government. So public matching funds, the kinds of voting reforms that we finally have seen in New York in the last few years really change it, because especially what happens in a state capital. Most of them are away from the commercial centers of their state, not all of them. They're, I say in the book, the elected officials and their staff are renting. It's the lobbyists who own the place, because they're, bunch of them were there when I got there in 2009, were there when you were there, and are still there tonight. And they're not all bad, and I talk about this. And lobbyists can mean an advocate lobbyist, it can mean a contract lobbyist, but them and their fundraising networks, because no one else notices, have such outsized influence. My hope is, even without that structural change that would obviously be good, the States Project creates a little bit of a different dynamic, because by having grassroots donors who really just want elected officials or candidates to be out there meeting their voters, hopefully it sort of changes that dynamic for competitive state legislative candidates and competitive races. And we always say to any candidate who gets dollars from the States Project, all we want you to do is win and serve the people who hired you. Look, you and I both, I'm sure, agree on this. This is not a thing that nonprofits or PACs or the private sector should have to do. This is something government should do to make sure we have a clean election system. I hope we're doing a small part of good in that direction, but if every state did that tomorrow, it would fundamentally change the dynamic. The other thing that would fundamentally change the dynamic, though, is up to everyone here. People are very worried about who thinks democracy is going great. I can't see it.
You're at the wrong book talk.
Well, here's what I'd say to you. Who can solve it? Actually, weirdly, you can. If you feel like you can't solve it at the federal level, that's true. But that campaign finance issue you just talked about, which we both talked about, fundamentally changes the experience of being a public servant. Or paid family leave, which now more than 100 million Americans have. Or Obamacare, which is still denied to nearly 100 million Americans in states that haven't adopted it. Or cheaper, cleaner energy, where states have adopted forward-thinking policies stronger and better than Paris, even while presidents have gone on every one of these issues. People could have an impact on the outcome, regular people. People like you or I would have been if we hadn't gotten lucky in our first races. And here's the thing. It's harder, it's a little less exciting. Most of the nights don't feel like this one, believe me. But if we're worried about the democracy, each of us has an obligation to think rigorously about how we can have the single biggest impact with any dollar or minute we have. It's not about how we feel. It's about who has power in this country and whether the 250-year-old experiment continues. If you're rigorous with yourself, you don't need to be a spectator to the destruction of the democracy. This book is hopefully a step to help people be a player or participant in improving it, in having an actual role, not just in how they feel, but in a fundamental shift in the outcome. So I hope people take me up on that.
Ladies and gentlemen, one more time for Daniel Squadron.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, so much.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for coming. It has been such a pleasure. And now we will head on to the next small event in New York City. We thank you so much.